Hello again, and welcome to AGRC 210. This is Unit 6 and the first part of a two-episode lecture on handling objections and dealing with resistance from your customers and or your leadership team that you're working with. So should be an interesting discussion, and this is one of those points, again, that causes some anxiety amongst salespeople and speakers, is you not always confident, especially early on, in how your message is going to be received. So let's talk about some of the techniques in dealing with objections and resistance. First things first, what types of resistance can you have? And the first one is active resistance. And the objections that you're going to get are usually valid reasons not to buy, especially when you talk about the mind of the customer. Other kind of descriptions is it's a stated disagreement of a value benefit that you've explained to them or displayed. They just disagree that would work, and oftentimes it comes across very negative. And the thing that I want you to understand about objections, especially when you hear them, is the customer is testing your theories and your product in their own mind. And if they have objections and they're telling you about it, it's actually a very good thing. But always comes across as negative, of course, because it sounds like they don't want to buy. And maybe they don't. But generally speaking, they're at least testing it for validity. And so therefore you need to pay very close attention to their objection, what the objection actually says, and therefore how to handle it. Really, there's bottom line three reasons. We can boil them all down to three reasons for an active objection. Either, number one, they don't understand, so a misunderstanding. Number two, they have misinformation, or simply not enough information. So we're going to hit on those three items here in more detail. When you look at misunderstanding part of active resistance, and this happens very, very common, is customers just simply don't understand maybe some features and benefits that you've explained to them. Especially when you talk about new customers, a very new product or a new service, they maybe just aren't very clear on what is available to them. You can really cut down on these types of objections if you really, really work on your planning, your pre-call planning, to make sure that you're very clear on the product and service or the message that you're trying to get across. Really work on clarity, succinctness, to the point in terms of what you're trying to sell as a product or service. And then to back that up, really, really listen to the customer very, very carefully. If you've done a lot of very good listening through your needs assessment and understand a lot about your customer or your group, you can help cut down on this misunderstanding part. So the way to kind of help overcome this is check often for agreement and understanding. So especially when you get to a key feature or key benefit, you might do a check for understanding at that point in time. You may do something as simple as saying, is that clear to you? Or do you see another, or one that is almost like a trial close is, do you see how this might benefit you? Or do you see it working into your program or your farm? Do you see it working for your team? Things of that nature. Those are a little bit of a test close at those little checkpoints in there. And if you get a yes, then that generally means you're on the right track. And that also opens the door for a question or an objection to come out that you can handle right then and there. Next is misinformation. And oftentimes this is the rumor mill type stuff that may come around that's sometimes difficult to get over because they hear it at the coffee shop or the neighbor said so. But they've heard something about your product or service that maybe isn't true, but they have that perception to begin with. And so you've got to clear that objection before you can go forward. So always be careful and handle these gently. Be firm, confident, but gentle, because you don't want to be too crazy about discrediting their source right away, because it may be someone that they trust quite a bit or highly respect. And if you say, that's a really dumb thing, I don't know where you heard that, you don't want to insult them or insult someone that is a trusted resource for them. So correct the information carefully. If you need to provide supportive evidence or back it up with testimony and data, then do so. Be prepared for that. But again, handle these clearly, confidently, but delicately. And then the last is just simple lack of information. So, a customer may simply not properly know how to use a product or service. They maybe just don't know how to accurately measure its benefit. And so be ready to illustrate or demonstrate how you would design measurement tools, and be ready to help with that implementation part so that you can reinforce a product, service, or idea effectiveness. So that's active resistance. Next, you can also get some excuses. Excuses are different because essentially whenever you get these, they are just dodging. Things like your prices are just too high. It's really loosely tied to anything that you've presented. It's generally something else, something beyond performance. Maybe they don't fully trust you, but they don't want to tell you that. Maybe they just don't like your product and they don't want to tell you that, so they give you an excuse. But most of the time, they're hiding a real reason for buying when you get an excuse. Maybe I'm just not ready type of thing. Or thank you, but I'm just looking. I use that one a lot whenever I'm in stores or shopping for something. So those types of things are very common with active resistance. And so you have to be able to identify the difference between an excuse and an active resistance objection, because how you handle them is very different. Other reasons that you might get excuses is they may actually not be the final decision maker. They may have played along like they are for quite some time, but then actually when it comes time to place an order, they actually don't have the power to do that. Maybe it's someone else on the farm, in the business, or in your leadership team. It could be budgetary, and sometimes people don't have the money to purchase a certain product. They would like to look at it. They'd like to pretend that they could own it or buy it or do it. But simply when it comes down to writing the check or financing it or whatever, they simply don't have the money. And then finally, basic poor management skill. They like the idea of something new or better or improving something, but they haven't the slightest idea if they could actually accomplish it because their management skill is so bad. So you'll get some of these as excuses, and again, you have to be ready to deal with them carefully. And some giveaways whenever you get excuses is oftentimes they're not necessarily timed as clearly as what objections are. Objections usually come at an appropriate time. You can anticipate 70 to 80% of objections. Excuses are much less predictable. And so they oftentimes come out of left field, like your prices are just too high or I'm not ready. They can be really, really hard to handle because they may just stop you right in the middle of the sales presentation and say, I'd like to think about it, or I'd like to look around. And could be even nonverbal, where they just walk away from you or look completely away from you and kind of stop paying attention. And so for whatever reason, they've disengaged from the sales process here. And you really have to start doing some digging around to figure out what is the cause of these types of things. And some have asked me before in class, did you ever have that happen? Yes, I had lots of crazy things happen as customers gave excuses for not to talk to me or to get out of the sales process. So when you look at excuses, how do you deal with that? I would view that as basically a roadblock, and you've got to understand what's causing the roadblock. So you probably need to go back to probing questions. And if it's a misunderstanding or lack of information, blame yourself for it, even if it's not really your fault. Help that customer save face the best that you can, and go back to probing questions and see if you can flesh out why there's some challenges with them accepting the information or the idea or the product and moving forward in the sales process. If you get questions, again, questions are not the same as objections either. They may just need some clarification, but they're opening the door for some justification, apparently, so you need to be ready for those types of things. So be ready to pick out an objection, an excuse, and a simple question. Passive resistance is much, much harder, in my opinion, to deal with because it could be really almost invisible. It's hard to see unless you know what you're looking for. Here's where reading body language is really, really important. So sometimes the salesperson needs to ask, are there any objections? The buyer may just put you off. They may agree with benefits, but don't agree to purchase anything or put in an order. And so a really good technique that I think helps with this is what we call a trial close. And we're going to talk about closing in the next unit. But basically, you uncover silent objections. So you may say, well, a trial close, let's say we're trying to sell some hog feed, and say, well, how many tons of feed would you use in a month's time? That's a good trial close question. After you've gone through your features and benefits of your feeding program, you've answered any questions that they have, but you've kind of reached an impasse a little bit, and nobody's exactly sure what to say. You might come out with that question right there. Exactly how many tons of feed might you order in a month's time? So, if they answer the question directly, saying, I go through a semi-load a month, that would tell you that that they're really testing it. If they dodge you, then either an excuse or an objection is there, that now you're going to give them the opportunity to verbalize it, or you need to go back to probing questions a little bit more and find out what objection is being hidden at that point in time, that they're really not verbalizing for you. So again, I mentioned early on, is resistance positive or negative? And again, it's almost always viewed negative and debilitating, even sometimes for the salesman. And I would suggest to you that the only bad objection is the one that you don't ever hear or pay attention to. They're listening, testing that liability, seeing if their assumptions work. Never underestimate the fact that customers also have loyalty. Just all of us have loyalty to certain people, certain businesses, certain products. And if you're asking them to change from that, they have to become comfortable at some point in time that loyalty is now not worth it anymore to them, and therefore not as important as maybe something a little bit better. So you have to understand that that's a piece of it that it takes a little bit of time to for them to come to terms with occasionally. If they state their objections, that's given you a chance to affirm some of their decisions or affirm something that they need more information on, but always show the customer respect. Acknowledge their objection, even if it's really crazy sounding. Acknowledge it, that it's important, and then demonstrate your responsiveness by handling it appropriately. And because that basically shows them how you're going to service the sale and how you're going to deal with them as a customer on a regular basis. Are you going to be defensive and kind of offended by a question, or are you going to empathize with them, understand that they have a business to run or they have a job to do, and it's something different that you're asking them to do? How are you going to help them? And are you going to help them, or are you going to be defensive? And so they're testing you a little bit in that regard also. So we're going to pause there and finish up, call that episode 1 of Unit 6, and come back with the second episode in the next segment. Thanks for tuning into this one.